welcome. I've known all of you for a while and admired you, and I've asked you to this conversation because you are activists and organizers who found yourselves in key positions in philanthropy. For several of you at a couple of institutions, I guess Bill at OSF, Irv at Arcus, and Ford, and G at Cerdna, I guess, and Ford, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Might have missed something there. Yeah. So I just want to talk, this issue of the Forge is focused on organizing and philanthropy and how foundations, show up or don't show up for organizing. And, there are a number of other articles and sessions, but this one I wanted to, you guys have an unusual vantage point because you have been in a way on kind of both sides of that fence. And I've talked with each of you individually a bit about it. And I just want to have a group conversation. So let's start with before you were in philanthropy, before you went to philanthropy, you raised money from foundations or tried to. And how did you think about foundations, if that's possible to say? And did you have positive models to draw from? We all know about the negative experiences, but what were you aspiring to be? Why did you think you could make a go of it on the philanthropic side if you did? Come on, Irv, you're never shy.
Well, before I came into philanthropy, I never thought about going to philanthropy.
Right.
I was headhunted and persuaded to apply. But my impression of philanthropy was that it was irrelevant to any of the work that I was doing because it was actively homophobic and I was working in the LGBT movement, and most funders were actively not interested in funding gay people and the LGBT movement. So, um, it was something that you didn't get a grant from. Most of the movement was self-funded. It was mostly volunteer. It was, this was in the, I started working in the late 70s and 80s. And so it started to turn in the 90s a little bit and then much more in the 2000s. But so my impression was pretty detached. I didn't interact with program officers. I had nothing to do with foundations. I think one of the first grants that the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force ever got from a foundation was from the Public Welfare Foundation. And we were shocked. They funded our anti-violence work. And it was stunning. It was great, but unexpected. And my experience of, you asked about positive role models, I would say, like the Unitarians, Veach, New World, sort of the progressive little funders. And later on, decades later, I would say individual donor giving has been more interesting to observe and dynamic in some ways than mainstream institutional foundations. So that's my 2 cents on.
And you worked for Mike Edwards, right?
I did. When I went to Ford, I got hired by Mike to be.
Because I always thought that when you went there, and I knew you at the task force, I thought, from what I knew of Ford at the time, I thought it was a bold and somewhat risky choice for them to bring you into the temple,
Well, I was working at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force.
Right.
I was running it was my second stint there because I had worked there before as communications director and then executive director. I left, I wrote a book. I got recruited back to run a think tank. And I loved it. I loved building and running a think tank. That's my favorite job that I've ever had. And so I was happy. And this woman, Lauren Gums, called
up. Oh, Lauren, yeah.
Who I had never met. But I had happened to be on a project with a guy she was dating. He said to her, "You're recruiting for this job at Ford. You should call Urvashi." I mean, literally, that's how it happened. She'd never heard of me. I'd never heard of her. And Wayne said, "Oh, you should call Irv because I think she's perfect for this job." So she called me, and I said, "Lauren, I'm very flattered, but I'm not Ford Foundation material. I'm not corporate. I've never worked in an established establishment place like that. I work in a movement." And she said, "He's looking for a movement person. They're looking for somebody who comes from a social movement." And Mike was. She said, "Just go talk to the guy. What do you got to lose?" So I did, and I thought he was really smart and really interesting. And, you know, Gara, I don't think of myself as a high risk bet. You know, I think if you place a bet on me, you'll win. So I think you placed a
Don't
bet
take
on
that the
me.
wrong way. Don't take that the wrong way. I just thought, yeah,
You know,
you did
anyway,
very well in the institution. You navigated the institution extremely well, in my recollection.
but yeah, I
Yeah. So,
had to adapt.
how'd you get to Surdna?
Actually, very similar kind of set of circumstances, though lots of varying details, but similar themes. Um, when I was a very active in New York in the '90s, mostly around immigrant rights and racial justice, I was kind of in blissful ignorance of philanthropy. It was all volunteer driven. We worked on campaigns and a broader movement for racial justice in New York, a lot of coalition building work. These were, the kind of the best of the Giuliani days, as I like to remember them. Um, and uh, and I was shielded, and I really didn't think much about foundations or philanthropy or when the next grant would come from. But I was also kind of uh, uh, I was actually working on a book on youth activism. This was kind of during the super predator kind of mainstream narrative about young people of color um, days. And Billy Wimsett, who you all know, was running a press. He and I connected through journalism, actually. He and I were both in hip hop journalism. And he was running a small press, and he said, look, we need to put together a book to confront the narrative of young people of color as super predators. And he knew I had a background in editing and in activism. So would you edit this book profiling young activists around the country? While I was putting that book together, 9/11 happens. We put together a response, an
Is that the
anthology.
book Another World is Possible?
Exactly.
That's why I
Yeah.
first became aware of you. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and that was an attempt to kind of anticipate the crackdowns on civil liberties, Muslims, and to develop a kind of progressive framework around the response to 9/11. And I was driving around the country touring that book to local community groups, local bookstores, when Jeff Chang, and I actually remember getting the email from Jeff, forwarded me a job description to the Surdna Foundation, which was hiring for a program officer in youth development and engagement. So there was a window, a sliver of opening for organizing and activism. And I told Jeff I have no idea about philanthropy. But he said, look, the guy who's hiring, Robert Sherman, is really open-minded and wants to bring on a younger person, someone with movement chops. And so I really kind of fell down a rabbit hole that became my work for a couple decades following. So some similar themes to Urvashi as well, not intentional. I hadn't thought much about it before, but it came to be a really big part of my life.
And it's interesting, a theme so far is that both of you were hired by kind of progressive white men in these foundations who wanted to bring movement in more, Now, Bill, you were in Colorado, and I've had many conversations with you over the years about your keen kind of sense of traveling from one world to another.
Yeah.
How'd you get to
Jeff? Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate the conversation, and I just learned things about people that I've known for years just in the last 10 minutes. So I appreciate that. Let's see, how did I get from Colorado to OSF? And then I could share my impressions of philanthropy before I got there. Basically, I was an activist in Colorado. Moved there after college. It was a time when white evangelicals were trying to take over the state. The year I moved there was the year that they passed on the ballot the anti-gay Amendment 2 that was eventually overturned at the Supreme Court. And it definitely wasn't the state of like Mork and Mindy and like hippie people that I thought I was moving to. It was very much contested space. And I did the kind of typical Colorado activist thing for a while, like public interesty, environmentalist stuff. And then I just realized the limitations of that. And for 12 years, then co-founded and led a statewide racial and economic justice organization that did C3 and C4 power building work. Started out as all volunteers. My then partner and I took on, like, we shared a 3/4 time position. It was very much a shoestring. We built it over 12 years time, and it was a very intense experience. I hadn't once thought about philanthropy. I of course had encountered it because I ran a nonprofit. And the larger the nonprofit got, in response to the challenges and the opportunities, the more time I had to spend engaging with philanthropy, for better or for worse. I developed I always have had, I think, a chip on my shoulder about the haves and the have-nots. Grew up in a mobile home and a cottage in Maine and single parent family and the whole 9 yards. And philanthropy always seemed to me to be a closed space. It seemed to be a place where you got to have the right last name or the right pedigree, the right type of credentialing. So I never thought it was for me. And it was always mysterious how people got those jobs. Like, where do you get a job that you get to give away someone else's money? I mean, you never think about that when you're a kid. I wasn't headhunted, but a couple friends shared the position description with me. Hadn't updated my resume for 12 years. I'd reached a really serious point of burnout in running the organization and working for 100 hours a week for 12 years. And then at 3 a.m., I just updated my resume for the first time in 12 years. And I wrote this letter that I did for pure catharsis. I didn't expect anyone would hire this guy from left field. And the first half of the letter was a critique of progressive philanthropy and its lack of transparency, accountability, urgency, lack of willingness to talk about power, let alone like blow it up. And the second half of the letter was a critique of what I saw in myself, my own organization, and too many movement partners, which I then kind of coined the phrase, and practicing an overindulgence of well-intentioned mediocrity and just patting ourselves on the back, fighting the good fight, but ultimately the conditions that we're all living in that are unacceptable aren't changing. So 3 a.m., hit the send button, and I was like, well, that was fun. I feel like some energy, the weight was lifted. I got to speak my piece, and that was it. And maybe now I'll update my resume and start to look around after 12 years of being a burnt out ED. And I was hired by your successor at OSF's US programs, Gara Ann Beeson. And Ann is a white progressive woman who is a movement person, a movement-minded person. And OSF is a kind of famously kind of elite place, elite strategies, elite pedigree. And I, for 12 years in 7 different roles, 9 lives, was kind of like the grassroots guy on our senior team for the US. And a pretty incredible experience, but I know we'll get into more the nuance of the experiences as the conversation progresses. But this is very unlikely for me to end up in philanthropy.
So let's stay with that point for me, because I all of a sudden I remember that you did have that critique. I mean, I never saw the letter, but I think we've talked about it. So I'm interested in the question of, like, when you come from the movement into an elite place, and all these places to varying degrees are elite places, 1% institutions, and you have a power analysis about the world. What did you bring to the work? So you're going from being in the movement and having some critiques of the movement yourself and critiques of philanthropy, and then you have the power, not untrammeled power, there are other people involved and all that, to do something about it. Did you, how did that transform? Did it feel strange? I'll start with you and then get to the others, to be in a relationship of actually some power over who got money and what strategies got funded? And did you, how did you always seem very self-conscious about it, which is appropriate, but did you decide, well, now I'm in a place where I can actually address some of the things that I'm critiquing?
Yeah, very much. I don't know if I did it effectively, but it was very much my orientation from the first day I got to OSF. The person whose desk I occupied was someone that I had tried for 4 years to get a response. to emails, phone calls, or letters or proposals, and I never received one. So it was just oddly fitting from the first nanosecond of my time at OSF. And the person's lovely, but people get busy and sometimes people don't respond. So from that point on, as I built a team, just first principles, like, can we be accountable and can we respond to people? Can we give direct answers, even if that answer is no? That's a sign of respect for people, not to keep people hanging, and not to do the typical funder thing, which is just send me something and don't do any extra work. But of course, people are going to work and send something, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the principles of respect in relating to the field and understanding the kind of some days just a shitty context for your executive director life or your development director life, and just being sensitive and thoughtful in that way and being responsive. I think it felt very strange throughout the entire time here. I grew to love it some moments, and then other moments I thought it was like, how could you hate your dream job? Because the contestation wasn't just about advancing social justice. There's also all this internal contestation that happens all the time. And your job is kind of a perpetual cycle of kind of strategy review and board meeting preparation. And what is so-and-so thinking about such and such? So maybe I'll be quiet here.
So that was a knowing laugh, Urvashi.
I was just laughing. It's the cycle of strategy reviews and board meeting preparation. That about sums it up. About 50% of the time, at least.
That's the advertised job description, right?
Well said. Well, it's interesting. I think I was very nervous going into that space at Ford. I was more confident going into Arcus because I had that experience of being at Ford, which was a good training ground for helping somebody build a foundation. Because I worked in the part of Ford that was civil society and philanthropy, so I really got to see a lot. And one of the best parts about philanthropy is that it is graduate school with money. They're putting you through graduate school, and you're not paying; they're paying you, and all that. And I always say, and I still believe. I mean, for me, going into philanthropy changed my class status forever. Working in the movement, I mean, on a good day, I was making $75,000 a year. And that was when we weren't giving back our salary so that the organization could meet its expenses. And I thought I was living well on that. But, when your salary doubles or even more, as it did, then and then you have benefits for the first time. It's extraordinary. And very sobering because it was so insulated. And, I called Ford's office the terrarium, like the little thing inside.
Yeah.
We were there in the terrarium. I went in with an agenda, and that was to organize the money so that it would go to places that it wasn't going. And the places that I really wanted it to go to were grassroots progressive organizations, social justice efforts, LGBT was an agenda of mine, and people of color. And so what was interesting was to go in there and meet kindred spirits like Mike Edwards and Lisa Jordan and Bonnie Jenkins and Chris Harris in my unit, and then, Alan Jenkins and Brad Smith and Natalia Kanem and Taryn Higashi. And we all had this desire to make philanthropy more in the service of social justice. And social justice philanthropy at the time at Ford in 2000, 2001, early, was not a mainstream endeavor. It wasn't like today. It's a social justice funder, and Darren has declared it so. It was not that at all. It was a struggle, and we were the heretics in building the field. Chris was seeding all this social justice philanthropy work, and then I started networking with other program officers and people in other foundations, and Gara started like the funder dinner group that still continues as a support group for those of us who are true believers. And then I started social justice infrastructure funders with Catherine McFate because we were like, we need to be talking to each other if we're interested in social justice infrastructure, and find the people across all the different foundations that are doing it. Just do it. So yeah, I approached the work as an organizing job. And so I did a lot of one-on-ones. I would meet with absolutely anybody, foreign office, whatever, everywhere, wherever, whenever they came to town. Curious, what are you doing? What are you working on? As a result, I feel like I built so many relationships across the world that I would never have had the opportunity to build because I approached it as an organizing job. My job was to learn, to organize the money, and move it to places that it wouldn't go. And I will tell a little story about occupying the desk of the person who wouldn't take your call. I was standing in the hall at the elevator at Ford early on, and this individual who ran a major DC organization, civil rights organization, who never gave me the time of day. I mean, like, ever. When I worked at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, we were the outsiders, and he was like inside. He sees me, and he's coming to meet Alan or something, human rights, and he goes, "Oh, Urvashi, how are you?" And then he says, "Al, my good friend Urvashi, something, something. We've known each other for so many years." It made me laugh. It's the power of the role, and you have to be responsible about it and acknowledge it. And but it was really revealing.
So, gee, I think of Surdna at the time you went there. Ed was still the president, right?
Yeah, Ed was still there.
Yeah. So, I mean, Ford and OSF have evolved in certain ways, but in their lifetimes, they've essentially been viewed as, progressive institutions, rightly or wrongly. Surdna, I didn't really think of in quite that way. So did you have more of a change job, and that culture was that? It seems like you were more of an outlier in that culture, even than the other two have described. Am I right?
Yeah. I resonated very much with what Urvashi said about going in as an organizer and kind of figuring out who you needed to move, and who you could kind of ally with on what fronts to move what agendas. And Zerdno, Ed was the founding ED of a family foundation that really reflected the interests of the family. And so it was that kind of hodgepodge. Also, like a good organizer, there were key moments, such as Katrina, that opened up me and Robert. Robert and I facilitated and led a year-long process with the board on structural racism, which was a concept that they hadn't really heard, or many hadn't heard or integrated. But Katrina created an opening, especially with some board members who grew up in the South, white board members, that were suddenly very open to questions of race and power and social justice. And then I also stuck around through when Ed left, because as we know, and although it seems to be happening at a faster and faster pace, kind of openings inside of big institutions don't happen very often, and you want to be around to impress your values and ideas as strongly as you can. So when Ed left, I stuck around for the transition to try to move a social justice agenda. And I'll just also say, because when Urvashi was talking about the transition and the kind of class shift, I wanted to build on that and offer that. For me, it was tough, or bizarre or disconcerting, for the class aspect, but also for the cultural aspect. For me, it was akin to when I went from all public education to an Ivy League university, and then an elite grad school, where I really had to kind of step back and try to understand what was being said behind the words that were being spoken, what the culture was, what the norms were, the visible and invisible incentives of an institution, especially an elite one. That was a really tough translation adjustment for me. And the other thing that I'll say about that is that as someone who came in kind of for youth civic engagement, and then the kind of successor to Urvashi's program, democratic participation, not your I came in kind of with a prescribed set of work. And as an organizer, was always looking to how I could expand and get out of that very narrow pigeonhole of the grassroots guy, as Bill put it so well. And that's a real challenge because you can get very instrumentalized, I think in that role, and it's rare, or you have to really fight to kind of uh, enter the kind of mainstream of an organization's theory of change or broader conversation if you are brought in as the kind of grassroots voice. And I think that's not an unfamiliar challenge.
So were there moments in your tenure, either of you, any of you, where you felt at some tension with your former allies in the movement, that you made decisions? I mean, I can tell you that I felt this. I don't consider myself an organizer, but I came out of human rights work and ACLU, and everybody I knew, what made me good at the job, what made me a person who was a credible person to lead OSF, all these relationships and experiences, at the same time meant that hundreds of people that I knew wanted something from me. And I remember on the death penalty in particular, where I had spent many, many years working on the death penalty, Tanya Koch, who also came out of that, and I, developed a strategy that I think was correct and moved the ball forward, but actually excluded from funding a number of people that we had been allies with because we didn't really think they were being very effective. It was hard, I mean, it was necessary, but it was hard. So did you have any of those kinds of moments? Or is this something that's hard to talk about and something that's going to be published? I'm sorry. It's not an.
I mean, I'll talk about it.
These 50 years after your life,
I'm trying to think. I think there's awkward moments that come up in a funder dynamic.
Right.
People look at you like, you're an ATM. But, when I ran Arcus, I said to people, if you don't want to be hit up for money wherever you go,
exactly,
don't work here.
Right.
Because it's your job. It's like, and you're at a party, somebody's going to talk to you about funding. And so that happened a lot. But because I came out of an LGBTQ movement and wasn't working on a queer portfolio, and the foundation didn't have one, there was less of a direct clash. But I midwifed a lot of people in.
Yeah.
And I saw that as my job. Like, in other words, somebody, who's like a total outlier or the area I was supposed to be working on would reach out to me, and I would find a way to facilitate a conversation with a colleague who I thought might be helpful. And I brokered a lot of those kinds of things. So I think that's how I kind of handled some of my own uneasiness about not being able to help groups because there was no portfolio about queer stuff yet. And eventually other places in the foundation started to do more queer funding. The other thing I'll just note is that this is to Bill's earlier point about accountability. I was always struck because I was always one of those people trying to reach somebody who didn't want to talk to me. So I made a decision when I got to a position of power that I was not going to shut down my accessibility. I answered, every email. I mean, I probably missed a few just because it's life, but I did. I really, and we had this correspondence control system at Ford, right? You had to track every letter was tagged with a number, and you got to sign all these.
And went in the vacuum tube.
Yeah,
Are you kidding me? Really?
No, we had correspondence control. Like, because they would get thousands of letters, and they created a system that they would be read by somebody and answered. And a lot of my colleagues would let those pile up, or just give perfunctory answers. I actually made a number of grants to cold calls because I explored them, and there were some wonderful ones that came in out of the blue. And I don't know. I think the biggest discomfort was the role of being a resourced person in many environments where you worked as a volunteer or had friendships which weren't resourced.
Right. Right.
I would offer just a couple things on that. I think one, it does require having hard conversations, and I actually think that it's not like when I was more directly involved in activism and social movements, there weren't also principled strategic differences with other organizations where you had to work out conflict, directly. So I try to kind of retain that spirit of kind of principled, debate. Um, and hope that people would trust that I was coming from the right place. B, I think also, when I got to Ford, I think when you get to any institution, people presume that you will suddenly you've discovered the skeleton key, and then everyone will be able to kind of walk in through the front door, if not the side door. But being clear with folks about what I was able to move immediately and not able to do, and realize that there was also a vacuum or a need for more kind of grassroots social movement funding, that I wouldn't be able to move it forward. And so built other vehicles. So I put in a lot of time and effort to help build Solidaire, which I thought was a necessary kind of intervention in the space. So using the position to kind of figure out what else is needed in the space. And then on accountability, I think, I remember distinctly, because it was so foreign and I wasn't familiar with philanthropy, but when the conversation progressed to take the job at CERDNA, I remember reaching out actually to key staff and peers, comrades at CAV, the organization that I worked at in New York. Sungi, Jane Bay was the ED at the time. Aijin was on staff. She and I started as volunteers together. Haeyoung, Yoon, and I were really close volunteers. And I remember I had conversations with those three in particular, but with others, to ask them, like, is this the right thing for me to do? And I remember Jane, Sungi was like, are you kidding? Like, yes, go, move money. But I think it was a reflection of my desire to want to be accountable to at least an organization, if not a broader community, and kept those lines of communication open throughout my time. And those people, especially Aijin and Haeyoung, are still very, very close to me. And I consult with them on big decisions, because philanthropy does not encourage accountability outside of organizational hierarchy, and I think having a practice of self-developed and enforced accountability is really important.
Bill?
All of that resonates with me. I think I approached the job as Urvashi was sharing, as an organizer, and took every call. Sometimes missed deadlines because I was taking every call. But I just felt like this is the most unique opportunity to hear from people that probably do a ridiculous amount of planning for every conversation with someone like me in this position. And I owed it to them to listen and to be accessible. And I also similarly found some of the most interesting, creative, thoughtful perspectives represented in the folks who weren't the ones that had, my boss or people on our board on speed dial. So I thought it was really important to kind of democratize the access. And if I couldn't be helpful, then at least to try to make a connection through my network or through other peers in the funding world to say, here's another person that I can help to make an introduction to. For me, it wasn't as much of an issue with tensions because I left very deep state level work and then went to the national level. I think had I done that now instead of in the late 2000s, I probably would have been better connected nationally. But I think that was a moment in time that preceded a lot of the really strong webbing of social justice, kind of state and local social justice work around the country.
If you were in a state working, you might be more atomized than is the case now, with
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I
relationships
felt
among
so
movement.
isolated, Gara, like as an activist, even just,
Right, right.
until doing the Rockwood Leadership program. I just felt kind of, we were doing our thing in Colorado, pretty disconnected from the
Right.
rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you, I mean, I started at the top, as it were, right? I went to be the head of a large foundation or create it and then headed another large foundation. And I always felt keenly that the role, I tried not to confuse, the way I was treated, with myself, but as the role, but also, if I said I was going to go to a reception for some grantee, I went and did, because I knew that it was a big deal to them that I was going to go to it. And if I didn't, people would be upset. It was a big deal. And so I just felt keenly the importance to them of the role. And people would come and see me, and they would prepare very heavily. And you'd look down, reading over somebody's, looking upside down, and you'd see there was a memo, prepared for Gara LaMarche meeting, and hours of work had gone into how to strategize about me. And it can be disabling if you think too much about it. But I tried to be as respectful of the fact that people were getting their moment, to make their case, and it's their job to try to make their case. And if you, like Urvashi or somebody said, if you don't like the fact that you're going to be hit up, go into a different business. It's a high class problem. So I want to shift a little bit to, because I know Ford and OSF pretty well, certain less well. And, they're a mix of kind of sympathetic leaders, and people who don't really quite get social justice stuff, And so I always saw my job, and I'm curious about how you think about this, as translational, that I had to kind of make a case for investments in power building and organizing to leadership like Soros and REA or the board, most of the board members. I mean, it changed when you were there, Bill, but when I was there, it was a much more elite board, college presidents and whatever. I had to find ways to get them to back, very progressive and almost radical strategies. And that was my job, right? And so I know you had, Michael Edwards was more sympathetic and Robert Sherman was, but all of you worked in institutions where there were at least some actors who weren't quite on the same page. And I'm curious about how you saw what you found successful at making that case. Because the bigger question underlying all this for this issue is, how philanthropy has a lot of money and power. How do organizers get more of it? How do we redistribute that money? And how do you do it through these essentially unaccountable institutions? What works to do that, other than your personal charm and diplomacy? So I'd love any of you to talk about that a little bit.
I mean, it's like coding, which I don't do, but I imagine it's you have to learn the code. And it's interesting. Somebody, when I got there, within my first 6 months, she took me aside and she gave me a book. It was called Power Talk. It was like sort of like, how do you use language to be more effective in a workplace? And I'd never read business books in my life. I think this was one of the first business books that I read. And I found it helpful because it was basically saying, you, without changing the content of what you're saying, you have to present in a way that can be legible and heard by the people to whom you are speaking. Which that's what we do is in organizing. You have to you connect. And that was helpful because I'm trained as a lawyer. You behave a certain way, you speak a certain way in court, you behave a certain way in front of a judge, you operate within certain rules when you write a brief. And it was similar to me at Ford. Arcus was a little different experience. And I'm glad I had both because one was more freeing than the other. One was like learning the code of an institution that had been established that you were trying to change. And so, certain things, you had to speak in a certain way and all that. But I also made a decision that I wasn't going to downplay anything. And you know me, I'm a terrible poker player. If I don't like something, I'm sitting like this, you know, and scowling, and or I say it. I raise my hand and I say it. The other thing that worked well was humor. So I started a defund Harvard campaign when I was at Ford as a strategy to raise the question of why were so many grants going to people at Harvard. And I literally would sit in the big program officer meetings when people would present and raise my hand and say, was there no scholar at the University of Michigan or University of Pennsylvania that's working in this space? And, in a nice way with a smile on my face. And my colleagues probably wanted to choke me, but when I left, they gave me a nice Harvard t-shirt with a silk screened X through it, and the back it said defund Harvard.
That's funny.
It was very funny.
That's very funny.
But I think, in all seriousness, the two things that help in any institution, you have to have some people, when you're not a senior person, when you're not the president of the foundation like you were, Gara, when you're a program officer, you have to have some allies above you, and you have to have peers around you. And so those are the two forces that help me move a social justice infrastructure process forward, or move certain grants forward, through the legal review process. I got the Black Radical Congress funded, like it got Political Research Associates funded, and the big argument was political. Their name is political. I said, they have nothing to do with politics. They're a think tank that studies the right wing, but their name is political. We can't fund a group that says Political Research Associates. People will think we're funding a campaign. And anyway, I had people above me, Brad, Natalia, and Mike, and people around me, like you and others outside of the foundation, who were like, go for it, do it. And even within the foundation, people who you could commiserate with and say, oh, I lost this battle, what do we do? So there were many, many moments of despair and defeat around a particular grant, around stupid things that people were saying or whatever, or directions that the foundation took, especially around like after the Durban conference. It was such a nightmare.
God, yeah.
That's when I was there. And, that's what lifts you forward. Relationships.
Totally agree, and totally agree about the coding. But I also, and I know all of you in this way too, that the comfort with being comfortable with your principles and your vision, and the willingness to be agitational at times too. And I know, even though I don't have a law degree and didn't go to Harvard, I love the defund Harvard campaign, by the way. I can write a good memo for a board meeting. I can do that, and I can play the game to move things effectively, and was able to kind of stick around for a number of years. But I always felt that since I didn't really think that I belonged here, that I might as well be true to myself and the agitational, kind of the anti-hierarchical, just the person that is me. And so there's always this tension at board meetings or with senior leadership. And yes, I was probably pigeonholed as the grassroots guy, but I'm glad there was a grassroots voice there in many of the conversations. Sometimes it was so tenuous, right? Like if the one board member who really supports the grassroots strategy, drank too much coffee at breakfast and left the room during a particularly important moment during a board meeting, you could lose your strategy. So sometimes it was that tenuous at times. And I don't think I'm overstating that. It actually, that's an actual moment. But I think just the critical nature of bridging the inside and outside worlds, and reminding people on the inside that the local knowledge and the people that are sharing their lived experiences, or should be sharing with us their lived experiences, can help to inform our strategies more than just whatever brief or whatever academic journal that we just read. Yeah.
Well, I think, in my days at OSF, the leadership, George and Aria and many of the board members, they were very comfortable with public interest law. They were very comfortable with, they understood that. They were comfortable with think tanks, but, much less so with, power building and organizing. And George in particular had a real resistance to it, born of his own sense of,
Completely understandable.
And the communists and anybody in the streets, that's not a good thing. It's the mob, and
Yeah.
You had to kind of find ways to relate what you were doing to something in his own experience, he wasn't so race forward then, but he did have a very high degree of sensitivity to the discrimination against Roma people in Europe. And so you could talk about the US race issue by reference to the Roma, and you might be able to get through, So I assume all these institutions have similar kinds of dynamics, where it's not so much about being even progressive. It's about, funding that challenges power in a different way than a think tank report or even a public, a lawsuit might.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's such a discomfort, I think, with kind of anger and real, I'm not talking within the institution, about like the anger that exists in our country and around the globe because of inequality, because of discrimination, and the comfort with kind of a more polite society advocacy model.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really happy that this seems to be dissipating. But that comfort level with people that look like us, talk like us, that kind of held us back in a lot of ways. And it's completely understandable why George Soros has a very legitimate fear of ill-informed populist movements. That doesn't mean that this particular grantee that has a kick-ass campaign for domestic workers is an ill-informed populist movement.
Right.
Yeah, I would only add that the three approaches that in addition to ones that Phil and Urvashi named, are for me kind of the three keys that I would try on every lock. Was the moral argument. Basically, it's the right thing to do, and I think a lot of our language of the most affected must lead hinges upon a moral argument, essentially self-determination, right thing to do. I think that worked for me, to be quite frank, with a lot of white liberal audiences or kind of center audiences. The second approach that I used, and this was something that I did a lot in my early days at Ford, was a kind of utilitarian argument that this is part of a bigger social change process, and you need litigation, advocacy, organize, you need the ingredients, the recipe calls for these 6 ingredients. So you must therefore include the 6th ingredient. And that was the kind of utilitarian social change formula argument that I used. And then the last one, I think, is the one that we're all pointing to now, that I found to be the rarest, which is the kind of power and social change strategy argument. Where is the distribution of power in society? How do we address that? And that's, I think, the hardest one to have. And I reserved for very rare occasions when it seemed like the conditions were ripe.
Well, I found myself in Atlantic, where I had a board that was somewhat skeptical when we moved very heavily into organizing. The NCRP had done, which I wasn't on the board then, but had done a series of reports, in effect, on return on investment. In New Mexico, these things were achieved, I'm not that comfortable with utilitarian arguments. I'm more comfortable in the realm of moral arguments. I did a whole speech in this a couple of years ago, but look, you use what, if you can use a utilitarian argument because look, in a public interest lawsuit, it's if not binary, it's fairly clear, right? The ACLU sues somebody and the practice stops, whatever. And it's a little hard. I remember Herb and Marion Sandler, for instance, having many discussions with them, and I know Deepak Bhargava did. They could not really get that. They knew how the ACLU worked. They didn't know how did ACORN achieve something, and it was because it's a different kind of process. But if you can engage the kind of cause and effect, in some way, for some people, that's a really important, argument. Why wouldn't it be?
I was thinking that in the two donor-led contexts in philanthropy in which I've had a role, I spent 10 years on the Gill Foundation board, and then I, helped John Stryker build Arcus for 5 years and run it. And that's a different set of decision making, a different kind of decision making structure than you have within the kind of institutions that we've been talking about so far: Atlantic, Ford, Cerdna, OSF. And the decision makers are individuals. They go quickly. They are influenced by a whole different kind of actor: their friends, their social circle, their partners. And it's not as, it can be less systematic. The argument, you can make an argument and it can fall flat because it's really not the basis on which the decision is being made. It's emotion or experience or I want to do this. And it's a different way one has to operate. And when I think about it, there's pros and cons to both. I felt freer working in an individual donor space. It was certainly, the power argument was much more successful in that space. That we can, okay, what's the outcome we're driving for? Let's make it happen. And, but then the kind of predictability for the grantees or like a sort of a accountability to the field can disappear very quickly as interests change. So that was interesting. But I do think, so I don't know if one is better than the other. I mean, both spaces are incredibly privileged. And that's one, thing that we've all touched on that I just want to underscore. I've been struck being outside of philanthropy now for a number of years and back on the grant seeking side at just how comfortable it was, to be in it on so many levels. It was so secure. It was so safe. And risk taking is not particularly encouraged. So if you were inclined not to be a risk taker, you got a lot of props for that. And I think it's one of the reasons things don't move as fast as they need to. I appreciated your word urgency, Bill, that in your critique of philanthropy, there is a lack of urgency. I mean, look at what's happening, right? And I mean, do any of us think that foundations have stepped up to meet the COVID challenge? I don't think so. I mean, like racial disparities have been revealed in healthcare. Have the healthcare foundations started to do anything different? Not to my knowledge, but I may just be ignorant. I guess what I'm saying is I think that it's a field that just kind of operates at its own pace and pats itself on the back a lot and gets patted on the back a lot by grantees and powers that be. And it's not really risk capital.
So I guess the final question, because we're almost at the hour, is back to, the earlier part of the conversation with G. Is another world possible? I mean, is philanthropy, can it be reformed or could it be blown up? I mean, it is an institution that is a creature of a tax code that privileges rich people to spend their money as they wish while we starve public systems of the necessary resources.
Well, I think there is a shift in a positive direction. The diversification, not just of identity, but of expertise, that is increasingly the reality at institutions large and small within philanthropy, I think is encouraging. I don't necessarily know if that is consistent with boards and the senior leadership. My sense is it's probably not. There are many more movement people now in philanthropic jobs and foundation jobs. And I think there is, because of this moment on race and on the pandemic, where foundations did change practices. And it's really unfortunate that I had to take a pandemic and just this global awareness of anti-Blackness for foundations to say, okay, maybe you don't have to send us a grant report. And here we're changing our practices, and hopefully it won't require a pandemic or similarly continued awful actions for foundations to keep those practices. So that's my hopeful side of the coin. The less hopeful side of the coin is, I think in a way that the way that dollars are increasingly moving to organizations and communities through the donor advisor industrial complex, through the funding intermediaries, through the rise of individual donors, and maybe I'll be more specific, the individual donors in kind of the Silicon Valley kind of direction, it's making traditional philanthropy less significant, less powerful, still influential and still with money. And you may get that outcome clarity that you're talking about, Urvashi, from the individual donors. But as you said, you lose the kind of connection to the sustained support of people and movements and organizations, and it leads toward the outcome clarity is a transactional one. But I have noticed in the last, I mean, how could you not notice in the last 5 to 10 years, just the rise of this kind of outside of institutional philanthropy, but institutional philanthropy proximate, just like an explosion of new people and new advisors and new nodes of money.
Yeah, I call it the second Gilded Age philanthropy, really challenging and casting a very long shadow over the first Gilded Age philanthropy. And I agree, Bill, there's definitely positive developments. But as someone who likes to hedge their bets, I think one of the more important hedges to take, especially for organizations with membership bases, is what I think some organizations have done very aggressively, which is to explore revenue. And not be as foundation dependent. I think we have to really kind of not just hope for the positive evolution of philanthropy, but also solve the problem from multiple angles.
Couldn't agree more.
I think that is the way to go. And among the contributions to this issue will be some about alternative ways of raising revenue, because I think you're never going to get the revolution funded by the 1% in the way that it needs to be, in the manner that it needs to be, or at the scale it needs to be. Well, I'm going to let you go because we've gone on an hour. There are a lot of other things I'd like to explore, but I want to respect your time, and I'm really grateful that you were able to reflect on your experiences in philanthropy and organizing with me today. And I think a lot of people will benefit from the conversation. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it, Gara.
Well.
Bye, Urvashi. Bye, G.
Bye-bye.